I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, I welcome Stanford Communications Professor Jeremy Bailenson, founding director of Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab and senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. Educated at the University of Michigan with a PhD in cognitive psychology from Northwestern, he's the author or co-author of over 200 articles and co-author of a book titled Infinite Reality, as well as author of a more recent book, Experience on Demand. He's also a pioneer and leader in both augmented and virtual reality, and I welcome him to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to see you.
So good to see you again, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you, and we've had a lot of Stanford people, and you're in good company, and they're in good company, and let's begin by saying you're really, as I said, a pioneer early on, and in fact, you thought you were a little bit too early on VR, didn't you?
Yeah, so I began my journey in virtual reality in 1999. I got a PhD in traditional cognitive psychology where I was building models of how the brain worked, how you would make decisions, how you would see, how you would reason. And in 1999, my fifth year of my PhD, I decided I didn't want to be a traditional cognitive psychologist. I wasn't in love with the topic. It was a very saturated field. And so I decided on a lark to apply for a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, where the postdoc was to build virtual reality and use it as a tool to study the brain, the same way that you would use a computer to run studies with reaction time. Virtual reality, you could use that early on as a tool to better understand cognition, social behaviors, etc.
Well, and it certainly led you on a trajectory that's been very fulfilling and I know very successful. In fact, in 2020, the IEEE, which is a Pre-Virtual Augmented Reality Technical Achievement Award, they conferred upon you. That's an electric and electronical engineer group. That seems a far remote way from cognitive psychology, but also a testament to your achievements. And this role of pioneer prompts me to ask you, where are we now? Because there was so much promise initially, and has it fulfilled its promise?
So many of us in the field of VR have long predicted what we call the hockey stick function. All of a sudden you're going from thousands of users to tens of millions or millions to hundreds of millions. And, Silicon Valley has kind of primed us to expect that kind of an exponential curve. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing with VR is when the use cases are great, and I'm happy to go over when the use cases are great, we're seeing people are using it, and the medium has some traction, but the curve is slowly increasing over time as opposed to turning a corner. And, VR is a fantastic medium when it's used properly. When it's used gratuitously, it doesn't work. People just buy these headsets, they collect dust. So really, one of the things that we study in the lab is what are the use cases that it really earns its keep, meaning you put on that VR headset, you can't see the real world, it's heavy, you might get a little bit dizzy, you get some marks on your forehead from indentations. The medium is not free, so we study when it works.
I did an experiment early on with the headset, and I knew, despite what my brain may have been experiencing, or telling me I was experiencing, that I was in a virtual reality. I was in a non-reality. I mean, conceptually, that was my experience.
So we call that presence. Presence is technically defined as the illusion of non-mediation. In other words, when VR works, the medium disappears. And one of my favorite stories about presence, we were filming 60 Minutes in the lab. This was about in 2015 or so. The recognizable reporter who was doing the interview, he did an earthquake demo. And in the earthquake demo, you're in the lab and the floor starts to shake and these boxes fall down and you go hide under a table. It's about teaching you earthquake preparedness so your body has the muscle memory of surviving an earthquake. And in this instance, the reporter was underneath the virtual table and he had 3 cameras trained on him the whole time, 60 Minutes crew. And one of the boxes happened, it's probabilistic every time those boxes fall down, it's a different pattern. One of the boxes happened to clear the edge of the table. In other words, the crates are about 1 inch smaller than the height of the table. In my thousands of times running this demo, I'd never seen a box get under the table to his hiding place. When the box goes underneath him, he had an utter panic attack. So he stood up and he sprinted towards the wall. And in my lab, it's about a 10-meter square. Luckily, I was able to get up and catch him and prevent him from smashing in the wall. But this man had 3 cameras trained on him the whole time while his brain was telling him that this earthquake was very real. And so, when we think about presence, we think about the brain. You want to say it's just VR, but it feels real to the body.
Yeah, I know it feels real. And as long as we're talking about presence, let's talk about proteus. I want to understand this in a detailed way as much as possible. We're actually talking about transformation, aren't we?
The proteus effect was coined in the year 2005 by my PhD student, Nick Yee. And what the proteus effect says, Proteus was a Greek god who could change his identity. In VR, you wear avatars, and avatars, they can look just like you, or they can be a different skin color. They can be a different age, different body shape, a different species. And when you are wearing a body, either for a long period of time or when you wear these avatars in a very immersive scene where when you move your physical arm, it moves with you. And when the avatar receives a poke in the chest, you feel that on your own chest with a haptic device. What happens is something called body transfer, meaning the brain believes that this new body is one's own body. The part of the brain that contains the notion of self expands to include this avatar body. What we've shown in the lab over the years is that behaviorally, attitudinally, when people are wearing avatars that are different from them, they come to behave like them. For example, if you're wearing an attractive avatar, you'll behave more socially. You'll be more willing to disclose things about yourself. If you have a tall avatar, you'll negotiate more aggressively. If you have a female avatar and you're playing an online video game, you're more likely to engage in healing behaviors as opposed to battle. Study after study, whether you're in immersive VR or even in some 2D video games, has shown that people conform to their avatars. The avatars actually drive their behavior. And Michael, I'm so glad you asked about this, because what's fun for me as a scholar that's now been studying avatar proteus effect for 20 years, there's now been 3 meta-analyses published. And what the meta-analyses do is they go over every single study that's ever looked at the proteus effect, combine the statistics and the math, and come up with an overall effect size. And as your listeners likely know, in psychology, there's been replication crises, meaning some studies don't always replicate in psychology. And I'm thrilled to say that the proteus effect studies have been incredibly robust, that over 20 years they've replicated, and we can now start to really understand them at a scale that we wouldn't have been able to do 20 years ago.
And we've learned from, say, tall avatars as opposed to short avatars, and handsome avatars as opposed to maybe not so handsome avatars?
We've learned, so one of the easiest things you can transform in virtual reality is the height of an avatar. You hit a button and the y-axis scales up and somebody becomes taller. And when we think about societal issues of, say, for example, the research on Instagram, which is a challenge to teenage girls because they are forced to see, this ecosystem where everybody's beautiful, avatars have a similar problem. And it's pretty hard to find a non-beautiful avatar. And so when we wanted to look at attractiveness, this wasn't just to be clever or cute. It was because we really understood that in a world in which everyone's beautiful, this is going to have effects on how people behave downstream, which is why we chose to study attractiveness.
Yeah, especially on adolescents, so we've discovered, unfortunately. Let's talk about the effect on self and others, though, because you've been studying this for decades, and this is really the heart of a lot of your scholarly research. Where are we at now?
So when COVID hit, a lot of professors in March 2020, when shelter in place was just coming out, learned how to use Zoom. What I decided to do was to figure out a way that I could teach my classes in headset in virtual reality. And so what began was a long journey where I transformed my curriculum. I gathered about 250 headsets. We built VR content, and I decided to teach my Stanford classes in VR in headset. And so we have, for the last 5 years, we have an abundance of wealth of data where we understand when you take people, put them in headsets, they see one another as these groups, what happens when they come together to learn?
So you're learning all the time. I mean, this is an ongoing process, and Zuckerberg has put a lot of money into this. So I'm wondering what's propelling this now, particularly since I know you've had, a good deal of funding from the government, and now some of that is, shall we say, more iffy or more sketchy than it has been in the past?
So Mark Zuckerberg came to my lab in 2015, 2 weeks before he bought Oculus for what we now know to be $3 billion. And he spent 2 to 3 hours in the lab, walking around, learning about the content, understanding what's possible, what's not. And then we sat down in my office and really talked through, what VR is good for and what's not. I had no idea at the time that he was considering buying Oculus 2 weeks later. I like to joke I only got a 10% finder's fee, Michael. Of course, I got nothing, but so I have some insights into what he's thinking.
It was a virtual fee.
It was a virtual fee. That's right. It was done in VR dollars. So I have a good sense of his motivations, and he's been pretty consistent over the last 10 years. Facebook has now spent $100 billion on their VR AR wing, which is a pretty substantial number. So yeah, Facebook remains the I don't want to say the last company standing, because there's a new collaboration now with Samsung and Google working together to have a headset that is going to be perhaps able to compete with what Meta does. But Meta currently has a majority of the market share on headsets. They've changed the game in terms of you either use their headsets or you're not able to kind of participate with other people.
Well, excuse me, Jeremy, you've had a lot of funding from National Science Foundation, right?
I have been continuously funded by the NSF since I arrived at Stanford.
So does that look less promising now under Trump? Are you getting nervous about that?
We are always nervous since the Trump administration has taken over in terms of our funding, whether it's NIH, NSF, even foundations because of downstream. So, Michael, yes, I am nervous. Currently, it's been business as usual in the National Science Foundation. As you know, the Trump administration has started with the National Institutes of Health. So, and traditionally, NIH hasn't funded my lab. Of course, Stanford requires those funds in order to fund all sorts of things, ranging from the medical school to other types of scientists. So these things trickle down to me. I made the decision, Michael, about 3 or 4 years ago. So being come after by politicians is not new to me. In 2011, the senator from Oklahoma, Tom Colburn, came after me for an NSF grant I had actually to study the proteus effect. He featured me as one of the silly wastes of taxpayer money to looking at kind of video game characters and why would we care about this or do it. So the notion of having my NSF research scrutinized by senators and House Republicans is not new to me. Of course, we're now at a scale that's just wildly drastic. So when Jim Jordan's House Judiciary Committee started subpoenaing Stanford and other places over the past 3 or 4 years, I started figuring out a way how we could continue to fund our work even if the NSF money was gone. So I'm in from a selfish Jeremy lab position, we're in a pretty good spot if our NSF grants get yanked. I mean, I hope they don't, but we're going to continue to be prolific and do the work that we have to do. It's a nice thing of getting to be at Stanford. There's other sources, internal forces. So I'm paying attention to it. I'm worried about it, but we're going to keep on trucking either way.
Well, it's smart of you to get prepared for that. I think it will put you in better stead, to be sure. We're getting some questions, and I'll go to as many as I can. But the first one is from Fran Kepler. Thank you for the question. Fran is in Fresno. She says, as VR becomes more realistic, are there dangers we aren't yet fully anticipating or appreciating? And I was going to ask you about that. Many unknown things like AI are still in the system here.
So my lab does a lot of work on the downsides of VR, and you mentioned my book, Experience on Demand, which I'm not promoting. It's long past its sales cycle at this point. I'm happy to if anyone emails me, I'll send you a PDF of it. When I started promoting that book in 2018, when it was reviewed by the New York Times and the Washington Post, all of the reviewers were intensely critical that I was minimizing the downsides of VR, that I was this tech bro from Silicon Valley, and I was talking about how it could transform social relationships and increase empathy and make people aware of climate change. Meanwhile, Michael, chapter 2 of that book is all about the downsides of VR. And what changed for me after I got that really negative feedback from a couple of reviews from the New York Times and the Post was when I now speak of VR, I actually lead with the downsides. And we talk about the downsides. It's, the first one is distraction, meaning you can't see the real world. So if you're using VR on a train, somebody can, assault you. If you are walking around in your room, you can smash into a glass table. You can step on the cat. So we think about the mere notion that it distracts you from the real world. And when the Apple Vision Pro came out, there's lots of images and videos you can find of people actually driving cars, which is horrible to think about driving a car while wearing a headset. So distraction.
Unless they're automatic cars without drivers and becoming more prolific.
Yeah, I do not want to normalize. I don't even want to joke about normalizing VR driving. Like so far, we know that Pokemon Go as an augmented reality game has killed many people. So people driving while playing Pokemon Go has caused people to die, and I just don't want VR to do the same thing. So, but on the realism aspect, we do a lot of work on reality blurring, and so what happens when somebody can't tell an experience isn't real. We've done studies with young kids in elementary school showing that when they do a VR experience, for example, they're swimming with whales in VR. When you bring them back a week later, about half of them have formed a false memory, meaning they thought they've gone to SeaWorld and actually swum with a whale inside of a tank. And that's for kids. With adults, I love the question, and I love, Michael, that this is the third time we're having this conversation over the last 20 years. We have now in the lab, we have a demo now, we call it the perceptual Turing test. So I can put you on an augmented reality goggles, the MetaQuest 3, and I can show you 10 beach balls that are, and this is not full immersive reality, this is augmented reality where you see the physical room. 5 of those beach balls are real ones, and 5 of them are augmented reality, photorealistic, AI-created 3D models that look just like them. And if I give you the Turing test, you've got to find the 5 that are real. No one can do it. Nobody passes. In other words, augmented reality, we can now project images in your room that you can't tell aren't there. And so I do a lot of work on augmented reality. The tech companies have realized they're not going to get back their 100 billion by VR headsets. So a lot of them are pivoting towards augmented reality. We do a lot of research on what happens to the world when I'm walking down the streets wearing my Apple Vision Pro or my MetaQuest 3, and there's things that I don't know if are not real or not. Maybe I put them there, or maybe the platform put them there. But it's a very strange world indeed when we lose what's called common ground. We're not all seeing the same version of the visual world. So we think about that a lot and we do research on it.
So do we have guidelines?
I laugh because our government is working really hard to try to figure out social media, and they are not even successful at, 8 lines of text to try to figure out how to regulate and to think about the pros and cons and the guidelines. When you talk about this incredibly complicated world in which you're tracking someone's body movements and you're rendering objects in stereo and there's storylines and there's virtual touch, no, there is absolutely no top-down guidelines from our government. Meta and Apple each have their own internal people that think about policy, and I talk to them early and often pro bono. Of course, I want to help them on that. But in general, even among scientists, there's no consensus on what one should do and what shouldn't.
Yeah, well, you've taken the lab on the road. You've gone from the Smithsonian to Super Bowl, I think I read somewhere. And in fact, speaking of Super Bowl, you've also gotten involved in sports, still enhancing team sports in the way you did with STRIVR?
So STRIVR is still there. STRIVR is the company my graduate student Derek Belch formed in 2015, and we incubated it with the Stanford football team. So we taught the quarterbacks how to read a play. When the play begins, before they snap the ball, they've got to look around the field and they got to figure out what the defense is going to do. And in that 3 or 4 seconds before they snap the ball, they can change the play at the line of scrimmage. That's kill, kill, kill. Or they can go with the original play, let it roll. They can also ask a running back to move. So it's a really complicated visual scene, and they've got to make decisions quickly. And so we've worked with most teams in the NFL at this point, one year time or another, and lots of college football teams. And then we moved to basketball. In basketball, we weren't doing decision making, we were doing confidence. So there's a lot of people who play basketball who can do everything but shoot free throws. How do we get their confidence perfect? So there's a literature on visualization when you visualize success. The challenge is that when you're in a slump, it's really hard internally in your brain to mentalize positive stuff. So we would do things like have a big center shoot free throws while filming in VR until he gets 10 perfect in a row. And then before games, before going out, they put on the headset and they see themselves being perfect and showing good increases there. We've worked with the U.S. Olympic skiing team. We've worked with hockey goalies. You name the sport, we've done it. And it's a really nice use case for people to, get extra mental practice while they're off the field.
I don't know if you remember Charlie Garfield, but I used to talk to him about weightlifting with visualization. They were talking about people increasing the weight they could lift over their head by hundreds of pounds.
There is no doubt the brain is important to athletes, both in terms of decision making and then more confidence-based things. And for those, there's actually an individual difference. As psychologists, we study individual differences, things like personality. There is an individual difference on the ability to visualize and the ability to see an image in one's head. And VR is particularly good for those that can't easily conjure those images in their head. So in other words, what Charlie's doing with the weightlifters, we don't want to change that. But there is a subpopulation that needs VR because they just can't do it without it.
And VR can help us die better. Explain that to me. How does that work?
Well, the uses on VR when it is around end of life can range everything from you're getting a painful procedure, for example, chemotherapy, and you put on a VR headset, and during that procedure, you get taken away to a beach, and it's a bit distracting for pain reduction. I know from my class data, to describe the scene, it's so hard to describe. We've all been on Zoom for a while. And when I first taught my VR class in 2021, it was the summer, these students, we all put on headsets. I snail mailed them across the world, actually. And 200 students got in this very small room, and everybody got really close to each other and was touching each other and just being together. We call this social presence. Like in a world of 6 feet away from everybody all the time, just being able to be together and be close was important. So that social presence, when we talk about end of life, there's lots of situations where you can't be in the same room as somebody because of travel or because of issues of being contagious. And we don't want you to put you in headsets for a long period of time. We've got about a 30-minute rule in my lab, but it's a lot different from Zoom. You put on those headsets and you now get this closeness that you don't get from other types of media.
I was going to ask you about Zoom fatigue, too. You've done some research on that?
Yeah, so people never believe me when I say this. I coined the term Zoom fatigue. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in March 2020. It came out in April, and the editor decided to take the Zoom fatigue out of the headline. But basically, what I do is I study nonverbal presence and I study media. And so what I quickly learned after doing 8 hours a day of Zoom, there's 4 reasons why people experience Zoom fatigue in a way that they don't in the real world meetings. Number 1 is we call it a constant mirror. Imagine in the real world, somebody followed you around in your day job. Let's pretend you're a teacher or that you work on a factory line. Some person followed you around, and no matter what you did, every second of that day, they held a mirror up so that you were looking at your own reflection. Okay? That would be a horrible way to run your face-to-face job. You don't want to be looking in a mirror or seeing your own face the entire day for 8 hours. And effectively, that's what Zoom does with the self-view. We're forced to look at ourselves while we're speaking, and that is intensely exhausting for us. It's called self-attention, self-focused attention. And we know that causes exhaustion. It also causes stress and even anxiety that can lead to depression.
Well, here's a question from Nate Greenberg in Miami, Florida. Thanks for the question, Nate. What role does VR have in therapy or mental health treatments, and how close are we to mainstream adoption in clinical settings?
So one of the epic wins of VR before, I like to talk about VR before the consumer revolution, before 2015, even as early as 1995, psychologists were using VR to help treating phobias. So with phobia treatment, you do something called systematic desensitization. If you're afraid of flying, the way that the therapist, you'll talk about flying, you look at pictures of a plane, and then slow baby steps to give you tools to deal with that phobia. And the last one is they actually bring you to an airport. In VR, what we can do is we can make that process more efficient and we can make it safe. So in VR, we can put you in a headset and you're on a plane and experience turbulence, but there's no danger there. Or you don't have to pay for the airplane ticket simply so that you get the exposure therapy of going to the gate. So it's a really nice tool for fear.
You've had more efficacy too, haven't you?
I'm always careful about more efficacy when it comes to the therapy because a really great therapist can do things quite well. But in general, VR certainly has equal efficacy. And for certain types of people, it has more efficacy.
I meant more efficacy than the traditional way of step-by-step imagining.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And here's Peter Hamilton from Austin, Texas, who wants to know, how do you foresee virtual reality changing the landscape of education in the next decade?
So here in Silicon Valley for the last 2 years, all I've been hearing is this narrative of AI is going to run the world and VR had its chance and it's going down. Actually, where VR is succeeding right now, meaning this week, is in K through 12 education. And so one of my former students, Aditya Vishwanath, he runs a company called Inspirit. Aditya, he has trained personally 4,000 teachers across the country. And the way these teachers are using VR, they're not putting their kids in headsets all day long. Think about a field trip. You get to go to someplace special. Now, look, we still want our students to go on real field trips, but now a typical school will have like 30 headsets. They're on carts. They travel from classroom to classroom. And a kid, once every 2 weeks, will get a physics module, or she'll get a welding demo for vocational skills. And these headsets, they're used sparingly, but it's an epic win because it gives them this field trip or lab they wouldn't have otherwise. And a school doesn't need that many to succeed. So slowly and quietly, VR is actually starting to show great current use in K through 12 schools.
Yeah, in fact, I like what you're doing with climate change and ocean acidification, putting kids out there in field trips, and not only are they learning, but it's a catalyst to get them involved in more active kind of participation, isn't it?
We have been working on VR climate change for the last 20 years. We're about to publish a study I'm so excited about. Monique Santoso is the first author of this, and I won't go into too much detail because it's not out yet. But one of the fun things to do in VR, surprisingly, is something called Google Earth. So you've probably tried Google on your computer. From the satellites, you can basically see your own backyard. What we've been doing in this study is we put people in a headset, and they simply travel somewhere in the country that's far from their own zip code. It could be Miami, it could be Atlanta, it could be New Orleans, it could be Chicago. And what VR does, because the place feels so real, you just hear a news story about climate change in that city, either while you're in the city, in VR, flying around through the buildings and being there, or while you're looking at a picture of it. And most of my research on climate change, we've had to build these very complicated narratives about the future of sea level rise in your city. Now what we're doing is they're simply putting you in a place. And just by being there, the mere presence of being in VR in a city makes you care more about the climate change in that city. So it's a fun deviation from the body of work that exists up until a couple of weeks ago, which is you have to learn this lesson or to see a bleak version of the future. Now we're showing simply by being in the place matters.
Let me go to some more questions. Thomas Needles from Portland, Oregon. In what ways could virtual reality reshape our approach to workplace collaboration and productivity?
So my company, STRIVR, has transformed from sports to corporate training. And so in 2016, we gave a very fateful demo. We were in Arkansas, and a guy named Brock came into the Arkansas Razorbacks football office. Everybody loves sports, and Brock put on the headset, and he said, what you're doing with these athletes, which is showing them a complicated pattern, having them hear and see stuff, have them make a decision in their minds and then tell other people about it, is what every employee at Walmart, every associate has to do every day. And so what began was a journey where by 2018, Walmart has 4,700 stores. We had 2, 3, or 4 VR headsets in every single one. We deployed 17,000 systems in Walmart. Fast forward to today, we're in every single Bank of America in the country. So in Bank of America, if you work at a B of A, you can go in the back, you put on the headset, and you can practice a difficult conversation with a customer, right? Having to give them bad news. You can practice detecting fraud. I'm sad to say one of the demos I'm most proud of is active shooter training. So most companies that STRIVR works with, we've built active shooter training. And you put on the headset, it's intense. A guy comes in with a gun, he puts it right in your face, starts screaming at you. Your job as an employee is to keep people safe, right? You've got to calmly, direct people to do. You don't care about the money. You're just trying to save lives. The first data point, so when you do this VR, like, wow, it feels real. So you take the headset off and it's intense. The first thing you say is, wow, it was a really hard 20 minutes. The second thing you say is, I can't believe the people before me learned that in PowerPoint. And in 2019, when the horrible event occurred in El Paso, Texas, when a gunman shot up that Walmart in El Paso and killed so many people, the CEO of Walmart has said publicly in an interview for Fortune magazine that lives were saved that day because a number of the associates in that Walmart had tried and trained with our VR shooter training. Lives were saved because they made more accurate decisions, and they made it more quickly because, quote, they'd been there before, end quote. And I just got a couple of weeks ago a note from a teller at a Bank of America who had practiced, what happens when a gunman holds up the bank, and just, could not believe how mentally prepared they were for it, because it's the kind of thing that outside of VR training, there's no way to really prepare someone for that. And, I know that's not the collaboration dream our caller was hoping for, our listeners are hoping for, about building better objects and design, and that stuff's there too. But in my experience, training for these really intense, difficult events has been the best use case in industry for VR.
Brings up another possible downside, though. I remember there was a lot of sort of ominous speculating that VR would become so popular and so omnipresent in people's lives that they would want to stay inside rather than go outside and face whatever demons might be lying and wait for them out there. And also that people would be escaping through VR too much. It would be an escapist outlet. People would feel, why should I travel? I can just go to this place by putting my headphones on.
So a lot of us early on theorized that, and a lot of us were just dead wrong in 2020 when the medium that took over the day as opposed to immersive VR was your Apple phone or your Samsung phone. And so far, the device that is causing people not to leave their homes is actually the phone or the iPad. It's not the immersive VR headset. And we can talk about why that is. So conceptually, Michael, I agree with you. It's a concern. We've got to worry about media use taking us away from real world experiences. But now kids aren't leaving their homes to go play with other kids simply because they're doing text chats or they're playing Roblox or they're doing other things like that.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. I'm inclined, though, to ask you, speaking about a whole other podcast, about what VR or AR, for that matter, can do with respect to sexuality. Especially, we've got all these incels and celibates who are looking for virtual sex of some sort. And what can it provide?
Yeah, so early on, when you look at platforms, I was lucky enough to have dinner last night with Philip Rosedale. He's the guy that founded Second Life. You may remember, had its heyday in about 2007. Lots of people online as avatars, not really in headsets yet, but they were in avatars and spending lots of time in their Second Life. And there's a fair amount of sexual activity that goes on in Second Life currently. So Second Life may surprise our listeners that it's still around. They still have a lot of users. They still have about 500 million GDP every year in terms of people buying things, and a lot of things they buy are related to adult activities. On the other hand, you can read studies out of Japan where people are choosing virtual dates over physical ones, and that's certainly something that Japan is worried about in terms of their birth rate, but not a ton of rigorous academic study on that, Michael.
Question from Vic Mather in St. Louis, Missouri. Thank you for the question, Vic. He wants to know, how does resolution and frame rate affect how people perceive VR?
Thanks for the question. I have a great meta-analysis. If you search by my last name, which is Beilenson, and the PhD student, his name is Jim Cummings, Cummings. Jim did the meta-analysis that combined every single study that looked at issues like frame rate, resolution, latency, amount of degrees of free tracking. I don't want to get too technical here, but frame rate matters a lot. Resolution, not as much as you'd think.
That's a definite working conclusion, I assume.
Again, with the cool thing about meta-analyses is that they combine lots of individual studies. So I can say unequivocally with effect sizes, looking at lots of different studies, that frame rate is a really important, how often the scene updates based on your movement, right? So in VR, stereo movies have failed. VR is not a stereo movie. VR, you're moving your body around and the scene updates it. So why you have to have a high frame rate is because what makes VR special is your body movements, and you want the scene to respond to that quickly. It's really important. So
you were at the Sphere recently in Las Vegas?
So the Sphere, I have been working officially at the Sphere for almost 4 years. And in 2016, when James Dolan, who created the Sphere, many of you may know him because he owns the Knicks and the Rangers and Madison Square Garden, Radio City Music Hall, and Beacon Theater. In 2016, he came to the lab, did the classic demo we show in the lab, and pitched this notion of the Sphere to me. I kind of had my doubts back then because VR was in its heyday, and Jim said, you know what? No one wants to wear a headset. Everybody wants to be together. So I like this idea of the Sphere. And so I started formally working there 3.5 years ago. And it has been, this is the success case of VR. It really is. So 18,500 people go into this Sphere and they see the most incredible image anyone's ever seen at 16K resolution at 4 acres is the size of the Sphere. It's just stunning. You feel like you're in a different place. And then we have 167,000 speakers that move sound around. Sound just kind of moves and comes up on you. Your chairs shake. And then we've got wind that brings scent, heat, moisture, and cool. It is the most immersive thing I've ever done. And just being watching everything I've done in the lab. We've always talked about, entertainment and storytelling, going to the Sphere and seeing, we've got movies there that play, for example, Darren Aronofsky directed this incredible hour-long piece in the Sphere that's this immersive climate change experience. And of course, we have the artists, the Dead and Company are coming back again and seeing the Grateful Dead, Bob Weir and Mickey Hart do their thing. And when Mickey Hart pounds his drum, you feel it in your back with the haptic seats in real time. It's like he's touching 10,000 people at once. It's been... I am an employee for, reasons of full disclosure, but it is the most exciting thing that I've done outside my lab maybe ever. It's really super fun.
They're doing exciting things in a similar way in Japan. You mentioned Japan before, aren't they?
Everyone, especially seeing the success of the Sphere, now everybody's trying to come up with their immersive, whether it's concerts or for entertainment. People doubted the Sphere. So, and everyone was laughing at, so Jim spent $2.3 billion of his own money to build this thing. And everyone thought it was going to be, not everyone, but the narrative was that Jim's going to make this thing and no one's going to go. And it's been,
it's an enormous success.
Yeah. It's an enormous success, and it's just a special experience. It's really special.
Are we ever going to get to the point where we can talk to, let me put this another way, our grand progeny or our great-grand progeny can talk to us and have a conversation with us?
So Gen AI, since the AI hype has began, everyone's always told me that you're going to be able to go from some text into a 3D scene that feels real. And there's been, there's probably 20 to 30 companies that are trying to do that. And for the first time ever, I got to see it happen. One of these companies, I have no affiliation with them. They're called Meshi, Meshi.ai. My students, so in my virtual people class, we asked this for listeners that read Philip K. Dick. He wrote a book called We'll Remember It For You Wholesale. It became the movie Total Recall. And the notion behind that fiction was, imagine you could relive memories. And they felt so real. And so in this class, Michael, we had our students, 191 Stanford students. Week one, they had a really special experience. We had this room with all of these objects, and they basically built a new room. And however they wanted to build, they built their own space. We then had them build that in VR, and we never could have done it if it wasn't for this Gen AI company, because the Gen AI company allowed, if there was a Connect 4 game or a blue tent that had 14 rings on one of the poles, we could do it perfectly with small enough polygons you could see it in VR. It democratized the way to build VR. And so towards the end of the class, we asked this very intense question, which is, what happens when you relive an experience in VR? What does that do to your mind in terms of how it stores memories, your affiliation? And really, for the first time, we got to build the things that science fiction people have been hypothesizing for a while. So to your question, if I were to feed Gen AI now these really good 3D modeling softwares, if I were to give it the password to my Gmail, which has millions and millions of messages for the last 20 years, could it now construct me and construct my things and my mannerisms? And we're not 10 years away from that. That's soon.
Well, one of my guilty pleasures is sometimes listening to Howard Stern, and a friend of his named Ralph, who used to appear on the show regularly, died. And he wanted to know what would Ralph say about the Oscars, and they used AI. And they had Ralph, opining about the Oscars and so forth. Now, how are AI and VR going to intersect? To some extent, you have to be a futurist the way you think, don't you?
In some ways, I do have to be a futurist, and R.I.P. Ralph. Sorry to hear that. Baba Booey.
No, Baba Booey is Howard's producer.
I know. I just wanted to sneak in that word in case he's listening. So the ability to create. Everyone thinks that AI is going to enter VR simply because you're going to see a chatbot, and that chatbot can speak to you. And a lot of people are doing that, and it's just fine. We're actually building. Gustav Peterson's a postdoc in my lab, and he's building a climate change demo where you get to interact with a baby seal and learn about the future of ocean acidification and how it's affecting its food web. And it's very experiential. And the whole way through, you're actually talking to this baby seal using Gen AI. And it's a really engaging thing. But what's transformational for me with VR and AI is not so much the ability to speak, but to be able to create these 3D models. Like at Stanford, half the kids here can program sufficiently so that they can do the coding to make VR, but very few of them can do 3D modeling, which is creating a very detailed version of objects and people. And what Gen AI is now allowing us to do is to create those models trivially. I mean, it's just stunning. And really no tech I've seen in the last 10 years has been as important as the ability to use AI to make 3D models to democratize how we use VR.
This may not seem like democratization to some, but we've been sort of top heavy with Stanford people on this particular podcast, which has been running a couple of years now. And in fact, did a special project with the Beilenson Center for the West, which included 4 of their better known and more prominent people, including David Kennedy, their co-founder. Stanford is really still a very good environment for people like you to work in. And the work that you do is really enhanced by the Stanford. I'm not trying to give Stanford a free plug here, but it's true, isn't it?
I arrived at Stanford in 2003, and it was as if I became a sale, and the brilliance of the people around here just made me go. I mean, I have 6 scholars in my lab, 5 PhD students and one postdoc, and they are all so stunningly brilliant. And, just sometimes I just view myself as a snowplow. I plow the road and get out of their way so they can do their work. And it's amazing what the brilliance of the students here in particular can allow one to do.
No, you're still a modest man when you speak that way, and I admire that. Also, the fact that you have done so many articles. I often think, is Jeremy he's doing these articles often with other people. Do they use VR when they actually project these articles onto us or create them for us? Just something to contemplate for our listeners. I want to first, by the way, thank all who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can find on Apple and Spotify and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, again, I invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, and you can find previous episodes there. That's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions. Love to hear from you to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And my thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Jeremy Bailenson.
So great to be here again with you, Michael. Looking forward to the next one.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.